Late 1942, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning arrives in Europe carrying a reputation that could shake the sky. Twin engines, twin booms, capable of 400 miles per hour in level flight. It looks like nothing else airborne. American commanders expect it to dominate the Luftwaffe the same way it's proven devastating in the Pacific theater. Within months, P-38 squadrons stationed in England are filing after-action reports telling a very different story, one filled with frustration, mechanical terror, and an alarming number of empty chairs at debriefing tables. The problem reveals itself most violently during high-altitude intercepts. When P-38 pilots spot German fighters below and push into a dive to engage, they expect their speed advantage to carry them through. Instead, something terrifying happens around 500 miles per hour. The control yoke freezes solid in their hands. The aircraft's nose tucks downward on its own, steepening the dive beyond any pilot's ability to correct it. Airspeed climbs past 550, then 600. The entire airframe shakes like it's tearing itself apart. Some pilots manage to fight their way out through sheer muscle and luck. Others don't. Between October 1943 and January 1944, the 55th Fighter Group alone loses 11 P-38's to what reports coldly termed compressibility accidents. Aircraft that dive into the English Channel or French countryside with perfectly functional engines and no enemy fire involved. Compressibility is a word that barely existed in aviation vocabulary before the war. Engineers at Lockheed know about it in theory, but theory lives in wind tunnels and technical papers, not in combat at 25,000 feet over occupied France. What P-38 pilots are experiencing is their aircraft approaching the speed of sound, around Mach 0.68, in a dive where airflow over the wing's upper surface begins forming shockwaves. These waves change everything about how the aircraft responds. The horizontal stabilizer, mounted between the twin-tail booms, enters disturbed air behind those shockwaves and loses nearly all its authority. In practical terms, the elevator stops working. The aircraft becomes a 16,000-pound glider locked in a terminal dive with a pilot who can do nothing but watch the altimeter spin and pray. The Luftwaffe notices. German fighter pilots spent 1940 and 1941 perfecting their tactics against the slower Hurricane and Spitfire. They know every trick. The split Urs, the high-side diving pass, the chandelle climb away from trouble. When P-38's arrive, experienced German pilots initially treat them with caution. But by mid-1943, after observing multiple encounters, Luftwaffe tactical bulletins begin noting a specific weakness. If you can bait a Lightning into a dive chase, particularly from above 20,000 feet, there's a good chance the American pilot will lose control somewhere around 18,000 feet. German pilots start deliberately executing shallow dives when pursued by P-38's, knowing the Americans will follow and knowing what happens next. It isn't just tactical advantage, it's psychological warfare. P-38 pilots begin hesitating at the worst possible moment, that split second when aggression means everything in air combat. By spring 1943, morale in P-38 units is fracturing. These pilots aren't cowards, they're volunteers who crossed an ocean to fight. But they're flying an aircraft that kills them for being aggressive, that punishes the very instinct that makes them effective fighter pilots. Something has to change, and it has to change quickly, because the air war over Europe is intensifying, and the 8th Air Force needs every advantage it can scrape together. The Luftwaffe's tactical adaptation to the P-38's vulnerability isn't just opportunistic, it's systematic. By June 1943, German fighter units defending the Reich have developed specific engagement protocols for the Lightning, distributed through official training documents. Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the most experienced fighter wings operating from bases in northern France, has compiled detailed notes on American fighter characteristics. Their assessment of the P-38 is brutally accurate, formidable in level flight and climbing turns, vulnerable in sustained dives above 450 miles per hour, predictable when forced to choose between aggression and safety. Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, who's risen to become General der Jagdflieger by this point, reportedly reviews combat film footage from gun cameras showing P-38's breaking off attacks at critical moments. In several instances, Lightnings had bounced German formations with altitude advantage, initiated dives, then suddenly pulled up and away just as they approached firing range. German pilots initially interpret this as caution or poor training, but after debriefing several encounters and examining American aircraft that had been shot down or captured, Luftwaffe intelligence officers pieced together the compressibility problem. They don't fully understand the aerodynamic science behind it. German fighters have their own high-speed handling issues, but they understand it exists and how to exploit it. The standard German defensive tactic evolves into what pilots call the diving spiral. When jumped by P-38's from above, a Bf-109 or FW-190 pilot immediately pushes into a moderate dive, typically around 30 to 40 degrees, while entering a lazy spiral. This isn't a full throttle emergency escape, it's calculated. The dive angle is steep enough to build speed and force the P-38 to follow in a steeper dive to close distance, but shallow enough that the German fighter remains well below compressibility range. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, for instance, can handle dives up to 470 miles per hour with relatively stable controls. The Focke-Wulf Wo-190 is even better, remaining controllable past 500 in some conditions. What makes this tactic devastating is its psychological dimension. A P-38 pilot watching a German fighter diving away faces an impossible decision: follow aggressively to get within gun range and risk compressibility lockup somewhere between 18 and 15,000 feet, or pull up early to avoid that risk and let the enemy escape while looking ineffective to squadron mates. Either choice gnaws at him. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins of the 55th Fighter Group describes it in a classified report dated August 15, 1943. Our pilots know the aircraft's limitation. The Germans know it too. They're using our own aeroplane against us. Real combat encounters from that summer illustrate the problem with harsh clarity. On July 28, 1943, during a bomber escort mission to Kassel, P-38's from the 20th Fighter Group engage Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 3. The Americans have altitude and position advantage nearly 5,000 feet above the German fighters. When the P-38's dive to attack, the Messerschmitts immediately split and dive in different directions. 3 Lightning pilots follow their targets through 22,000 feet, then through 20,000. At approximately 18,500 feet, 2 of the P-38's enter compressibility lockup. 1 pilot manages to recover at 8,000 feet after a 10,000-foot uncontrolled descent. The other doesn't recover at all. His aircraft impacts in a forest south of Kassel. The Bf-109s climb back to altitude and rejoin their formation. No German losses, 1 American dead, 1 aircraft destroyed. The mathematics are unsustainable. By September 1943, some P-38 squadrons are being quietly rotated to ground attack roles or reassigned to the Mediterranean theatre, where combat typically occurs at lower altitudes. The aircraft that was supposed to dominate European skies is instead becoming a liability, and everyone from squadron commanders to 8th Air Force headquarters knows it. The solution comes not from Lockheed's engineering department or from tactical analysts at headquarters, but from desperation at 22,000 feet somewhere over Belgium. The exact pilot's name remains disputed in historical records. Some accounts credit Captain Robin Olds of the 4th 9th Fighter Group. Others point to an unnamed pilot from the 55th. But what matters is that someone, pushed beyond frustration and willing to try anything, does something that violates every instinct of a twin-engine pilot. During a dive pursuit of German fighters in late October 1943, with his aircraft beginning that sickening shake signaling compressibility onset, he reaches down and shuts off his right engine. The immediate effect is so pronounced he thinks something else has broken. The violent buffeting smooths out, the nose, which had been tucking downward despite full back pressure on the yoke, suddenly responds to control inputs again. The aircraft is still diving, still building speed, but it's controllable. He can pull out. More importantly, he can stay in the dive longer, press the attack closer, and pull out with altitude to spare. When he lands and describes what happened, the other pilots in his squadron think he's lost his mind. You don't shut down an engine in combat. You don't deliberately make your aircraft asymmetric while diving at 500 miles per hour toward the ground with German fighters nearby. It contradicts everything they've been taught about engine-out emergencies and the dangers of asymmetric thrust. But desperation makes people willing to test crazy ideas. Within a week, 3 other pilots in the same squadron try it during combat missions. All 3 report the same result: dramatically improved control authority during high-speed dives, the ability to stay with German fighters through 15,000 feet when normally they'd have lost control by 18,000, and the nose-tucking tendency that makes compressibility so deadly is greatly reduced. One pilot, First Lieutenant James Morris, documents his experience in a mission report dated November 3, 1943. Shut down right engine at indicated 480 miles per hour in dive. Aircraft remained controllable through 520, closed to firing range on FW 190, and fired 3-second burst. Observed strikes on enemy aircraft fuselage. Enemy aircraft trailing smoke entered clouds, unable to confirm destruction. Restarted right engine at 12,000 feet without difficulty. The news spreads through the P-38 community like wildfire, but not officially. Squadron pilots talk to each other at the officers' club, during downtime between missions, in the privacy of their briefing rooms. They share details: which engine to shut down, at what altitude, how to restart it, what to watch for. Some pilots report shutting down the left engine works just as well. Others find slight variations in technique. What nobody can explain is why it works. These are combat pilots, not aeronautical engineers. They don't need to understand the physics. They just need something that keeps them alive and lets them do their jobs. The resistance to this technique comes from unexpected quarters. Maintenance crews are horrified. The Allison V-17-10 engines powering the P-38 are complex, temperamental machines, particularly in the cold temperatures of high-altitude European operations. Deliberately shutting one down and restarting it in combat conditions seems like asking for catastrophic failure engine fires, mechanical seizures, failed restarts. All of these are legitimate concerns. Squadron commanders face a dilemma. They have pilots using an unauthorized technique that seems to work but carries obvious risks. No official testing has been done. No technical order from Lockheed or the Army Air Forces authorizes it. But it's working. Pilots who use it are surviving dives that previously killed them. They're getting guns on German fighters who thought they were safe. By late November 1943, the technique has spread to at least 4 P-38 squadrons in England. The genie is out of the bottle. Now the question is whether official channels will embrace it, study it, or try to suppress it as too dangerous. The aerodynamic explanation for why shutting down one engine reduces compressibility effects isn't immediately obvious, even to engineers at Lockheed's Burbank facility when reports of the technique finally reach them in December 1943. The initial assumption is that reducing overall engine power somehow decreases dive speed, but pilots are reporting they maintain or even increase dive velocity with one engine shut down. The real answer lies in the complex interaction between propeller rotation, airflow disruption, and the P-38's unique center-mounted tail design. In normal operation, both propellers spin at high RPM during a dive, even at reduced throttle settings. Each propeller acts like a large disc churning through air, creating a spiraling slipstream behind it. These slipstreams flow rearward along the booms and directly affect airflow reaching the horizontal stabilizer and elevator surfaces mounted between the tail booms. When the aircraft approaches compressibility speeds around Mach 0.68, shock waves form on the wing's upper surface and inboard sections. This creates separated, turbulent air that combines with the propeller slipstreams to create an aerodynamic mess at the tail. The elevator sits in disturbed air moving in multiple directions simultaneously, which destroys its effectiveness. Shutting down one engine changes this entire flow pattern. With one propeller stopped or windmilling at reduced RPM, the asymmetric slipstream effect actually helps stabilize airflow reaching the tail surfaces. The operating engine's slipstream creates rotating flow on one side, but the dead engine's stationary or slow-spinning propeller creates relatively clean air on the other side. This asymmetry counteracts some of the turbulence generated by shock waves on the wing. More importantly, it reduces the total amount of spiraling energetic air hitting the horizontal stabilizer at precisely the moment when that stabilizer needs clean airflow to remain effective. There's a secondary effect that pilots notice but can't articulate in technical terms. The P-38's twin engines sit far from the fuselage centerline, mounted in the booms roughly 8 feet apart, with both engines producing thrust, even at reduced power settings during a dive. That thrust is symmetrically distributed. But with one engine shut down, the operating engine creates a yawing moment, a tendency to rotate the aircraft around its vertical axis. To counteract this, the pilot has to apply rudder pressure. That rudder input creates a slight side slip, meaning the aircraft's nose points slightly away from its direction of travel. This side slip, perhaps only 3 to 5 degrees, alters the angle at which air hits the wing's leading edge. It disrupts the formation of shock waves just enough to delay the onset of full compressibility lockup by approximately 0.05 Mach, which translates to roughly 30 miles per hour of additional controllable dive speed. The mathematics aren't simple. Captain Harold Birkeland, an engineering officer attached to the 55th Fighter Group who studied aeronautical engineering at MIT before the war, attempts to quantify the effect in a technical memorandum dated January 12, 1944. His calculations suggest that the single-engine dive configuration reduces the adverse pressure gradient on the horizontal stabilizer by approximately 18 to 22% at speeds between Mach 0.65 and 0.70. That reduction is enough to restore partial elevator authority at speeds where the aircraft would otherwise be completely uncontrollable. Lockheed's chief aerodynamicist, Clarence Kelly Johnson, reviews combat reports and Birkeland's analysis in February 1944. Johnson, who will later design the U-2 spy plane and SR-71 Blackbird, is initially skeptical. The idea that deliberately creating an asymmetric thrust condition could improve high-speed handling seems counterintuitive. But when Lockheed test pilots try the technique in controlled dive tests at Muroc Dry Lake in California, they confirm what combat pilots discovered through trial and error. The P-38 remains controllable at indicated airspeeds up to 535 miles per hour with one engine shut down, compared to loss of control around 505 with both engines operating. The official adoption of the single-engine dive technique requires navigating military bureaucracy that moves at a very different speed than combat necessity. By January 1944, enough P-38 pilots are using the method that 8th Air Force Headquarters can no longer ignore it. But converting individual pilot experimentation into standardized tactical doctrine means training programs, technical orders, and formal approval from multiple command levels. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group and one of the most respected tactical minds in the European theatre, takes the lead in formalizing the procedure after witnessing a demonstration during a joint training exercise on January 18, 1944. The first structured training program begins at Boxted Airfield in Essex, home of the 55th Fighter Group, on January 25, 1944. Pilots who've successfully used the technique in combat become instructors for those who haven't. The training progression is methodical because the risks are real. Pilots start by shutting down an engine in level flight at 20,000 feet, getting comfortable with the asymmetric handling characteristics, the rudder pressure required, and the restart procedure. The Allison engines can be temperamental about restarting at altitude, particularly in the sub-zero temperatures common over northern Europe. The procedure requires setting mixture to auto-rich, priming the engine with 4 to 6 strokes, engaging the starter and advancing throttle smoothly once ignition catches. In the stress of combat, with German fighters nearby and altitude bleeding away, every one of those steps has to be automatic. Once pilots demonstrate proficiency with level flight engine shutdowns and restarts, training progresses to shallow dives, initially no steeper than 20 degrees. Instructors emphasize the timing. Shutting down the engine too early wastes altitude and gives away energy advantage. But waiting until compressibility onset has already begun means struggling with controls while managing engine shutdown switches. The sweet spot is around 460 to 480 miles per hour indicated airspeed, just before the buffeting begins. Pilots learn to recognize that moment not just by airspeed indicator, but by feel, the subtle change in control pressure signaling they're approaching the edge. The question of which engine to shut down generates surprising debate. Some pilots swear by shutting down the right engine because it allows them to keep their left hand on the throttle while their right hand manages the control yoke. Others prefer shutting down the left engine, arguing the resulting yaw is easier to counteract with rudder. After several weeks of training data compilation, the consensus emerges that it doesn't matter significantly. The aerodynamic benefit is nearly identical either way. What matters is consistency. Each pilot should choose one engine and always shut down that same engine, so the procedure becomes muscle memory. By March 1944, the training program has expanded to include all P-38 units in England. Technical Order 01-75F1, issued on March 8, 1944, officially authorizes the single-engine dive technique, though the language is carefully worded to emphasize it as a tactical option rather than a requirement. The order specifies altitude minimums for engine restart, no lower than 8,000 feet over friendly territory, 10,000 feet over enemy territory, to allow for potential mechanical issues and the time needed to handle them. It also includes warnings about the technique's limitations. It doesn't eliminate compressibility. It delays and reduces its effects. Pilots can still lose control if they push too far past 550 miles per hour. The aircraft is still asymmetric, still requires constant rudder pressure, still handles differently than normal flight. Squadron operations officers develop tactical formations that accommodate the technique. When bouncing German fighters from altitude, the standard four-ship flight splits into pairs. The lead element initiates the attack using single-engine dives, while the second element maintains both engines and stays higher, ready to cover the lead element during their recovery and engine restart. This preserves combat flexibility while maximizing the aggressive potential of the single-engine dive against targets. The first documented victory directly attributable to the single-engine dive technique occurs on March 15, 1944, during a bomber escort mission to Augsburg. Second Lieutenant Robert Anderson of the 55th Fighter Group's 38th Fighter Squadron spots a formation of 6 B-109Gs approximately 4,000 feet below his flight at 24,000 feet. The German fighters are positioning for a head-on attack against a formation of B-17s. Anderson's flight of 4 P-38's has altitude and sun position advantage. Under previous circumstances, this would have been a textbook bounce opportunity that often ended in frustration when P-38's entered compressibility during the dive attack. This time plays out differently. Anderson initiates his dive at 23,500 feet, building speed rapidly. At 480 miles per hour indicated, he shuts down his left engine while his wingman stays high to cover. The Messerschmitts see the diving P-38's and react with their standard defensive split, 3 aircraft braking left, 3 braking right, all entering moderate dives to force the Americans into compressibility problems. Anderson follows the rightmost element, pushing his dive angle to nearly 50 degrees. His airspeed climbs through 500 miles per hour, then 520. The controls remain firm in his hands. The buffeting that normally precedes lockup never intensifies beyond mild vibration. At 18,000 feet, he's inside 400 yards of the trailing Bif 109, still closing, still in control. The German pilot, likely assuming the P-38 would break off or lose control at any moment based on previous encounters, maintains his dive without aggressive evasive maneuvers. Anderson opens fire at 300 yards, a 3-second burst from all 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon. Tracers walk across the Messerschmitt's left wing root and fuselage. Pieces fly off the German fighter, smoke erupts from the engine cowling, then flame. The Bf-109 rolls inverted and enters a flat spin. Anderson confirms the enemy pilot bails out at approximately 12,000 feet. Anderson restarts his left engine at 14,000 feet without difficulty and climbs back to rejoin his flight. The entire engagement, from initial dive to engine restart, takes less than 90 seconds. Word of Anderson's victory spreads through the P-38 community within hours. Here's proof the technique works not just for survival, but for lethality. Within 2 weeks, 6 more confirmed victories using single-engine dives are recorded across 3 different squadrons. On March 22nd, Captain Harold Stump of the 20th Fighter Group uses the technique to chase down an FW-190 that had damaged a B-24 and was diving away toward cloud cover. Stump shuts down his right engine at 25,000 feet, then follows the Focke Wulf through 20,000, then 15,000, his P-38 remaining stable while closing the range. He fires at 10,000 feet from 250 yards. The FW-190 explodes, likely from hits to its fuel tank behind the cockpit. The psychological shift among P-38 pilots is as important as the tactical results. For months they'd been flying an aircraft that punished aggression. Now they have a tool that restores their ability to press attacks without the previous fear of uncontrollable dives. Confidence returns. Pilots who'd been tentative about diving on German fighters become aggressive again. The aircraft hasn't changed, but the pilot's ability to exploit its capabilities has expanded dramatically. The Germans notice something has changed, though they don't immediately understand what. Luftwaffe combat reports from April 1944 begin noting that American twin-engine fighters are staying with German aircraft through dive maneuvers, where previously they'd broken off. A captured German pilot from Jagdgeschwader 2, shot down on April 8, 1944, mentions during interrogation that his unit had received warnings that Lightning pilots had learned new tactics and were no longer reliably vulnerable in diving engagements. The specific nature of those tactics remains unknown to German intelligence for several more months, but the tactical advantage it had provided is clearly diminishing. German intelligence officers first begin piecing together the single-engine dive technique in late April 1944, after analysing gun camera footage from an FW-19 that survived an engagement with P-38's over France. The footage shows a Lightning in pursuit during a steep dive, and careful frame-by-frame examination reveals that one of its propellers isn't rotating normally. It appears to be windmilling or stationary. Initial analysis dismisses this as battle damage or mechanical failure. But when similar footage appears from 3 separate engagements over a 2-week period, Luftwaffe technical intelligence begins investigating more seriously. The confirmation comes from an unexpected source. On May 6, 1944, a P-38J from the 479th Fighter Group suffers catastrophic engine failure during combat over Belgium. The pilot, First Lieutenant Thomas Watkins, attempts to return to England on one engine, but is forced to bail out over German-held territory near Liège. He's captured within hours. During interrogation at Ushuaia West, the Luftwaffe's main interrogation centre for captured airmen, Watkins initially refuses to discuss tactics or technical matters beyond name, rank and serial number. But interrogators notice something peculiar in his personal effects. A small notebook with handwritten procedures for various emergency situations, including a section titled High-Speed Dive Single-Engine Technique. The German interrogators, experienced at extracting information through seemingly casual conversation, gradually coaxed details from Watkins over several days. He eventually describes the technique, though he maintains he'd only used it once and didn't fully understand why it worked. That partial information is enough. By mid-May 1944, Oberkommando der Luftwaffe issues a tactical bulletin to fighter units warning that American P-38 pilots are deliberately shutting down one engine during dive attacks to maintain control at high speeds. The bulletin recommends more aggressive initial brakes when bounced by lightnings from altitude, steeper dive angles to force the Americans deeper before they can employ the technique, and immediate hard-turning maneuvers once the P-38 closes to firing range, since the single-engine configuration reduces the Lightning's ability to follow in high G turns. Jagdgeschwader 26, which had been among the first units to exploit the P-38's compressibility problems, adapt their tactics within weeks. Major Joseph Pips Priller, the unit's commander and a veteran with over 100 victories, issues new engagement guidelines on May 28, 1944. When engaged by P-38s with altitude advantage, his pilots are instructed to execute immediate splits maneuvers followed by low-altitude, high-speed runs rather than the moderate diving spirals they'd previously used. The logic is sound: force the Lightning pilot to commit to a vertical dive early, consume his altitude quickly, and reduce the time he can spend in controlled pursuit before having to break off to restart his engine and regain altitude. The adapted German tactics have mixed effectiveness. They reduce the P-38's advantage, but don't eliminate it. On June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, a large air battle develops over Normandy involving elements of 3 P-38 groups and multiple German fighter units. The Americans claim 14 confirmed victories for the loss of 3 P-38s. German records confirm 11 fighters lost in that engagement. Several of those victories come from P-38s using single-engine dives, but several German pilots successfully evade lightning attacks using the new hard-brake tactics. The engagement illustrates that the single-engine technique has shifted the tactical equation, but hasn't rendered German fighters helpless. What the technique does accomplish is psychological. For the first time since arriving in Europe, P-38 pilots feel they can engage German fighters on roughly equal terms in the diving vertical fight. The psychological burden of flying an aircraft with a known deadly flaw has lifted. Meanwhile, German pilots lose one of their reliable tactical advantages. The Luftwaffe in mid-1944 faces multiple compounding problems: fuel shortages, pilot attrition, loss of air superiority, and now the erosion of specific tactical techniques they'd relied on against particular Allied aircraft types. The single-engine dive technique remains in use through the end of the European War in May 1945, though its frequency decreases as the P-38's role shifts and newer aircraft types enter service. The P-51 Mustang, which begins large-scale deployment in early 1944, doesn't suffer from compressibility problems to the same degree and gradually replaces the Lightning in many escort fighter roles. By late 1944, most P-38 units in Europe have transitioned to ground attack missions, where the single-engine dive technique has limited application. But the legacy of this unorthodox solution extends far beyond the immediate tactical problem it solved. Engineers at Lockheed and NASA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, and other aircraft manufacturers, study the P-38 compressibility issue and the single-engine workaround extensively in post-war analyses. The phenomenon reveals critical gaps in understanding transonic aerodynamics, the poorly understood regime between subsonic and supersonic flight where shock waves first begin forming. Wind tunnel testing in 1943 and early 1944 had failed to predict the severity of the P-38's problems, because available wind tunnels couldn't accurately simulate transonic conditions. The aircraft had essentially become a full-scale test platform for aerodynamic phenomena that laboratory equipment couldn't yet reproduce. Kelly Johnson's post-war assessment, documented in a technical paper published in 1947, acknowledges that the P-38's tail configuration was fundamentally flawed for high-speed flight. Mounting the horizontal stabilizer directly in the disturbed airflow behind the wing and between the booms created an impossible situation once shock waves formed. Future twin-boom designs, like the Northrop P-61 Black Widow's later variants and post-war aircraft, incorporated lessons learned from the P-38's struggles. T-tail configurations, where the horizontal stabilizer sits atop a vertical fin well above the wing's wake, become standard for aircraft expected to operate at high subsonic speeds. The single-engine technique also influences thinking about asymmetric thrust management. Before the P-38 experience, asymmetric thrust was viewed almost entirely as an emergency condition to be corrected or avoided. The discovery that deliberate asymmetry could provide aerodynamic benefits under specific conditions opens new avenues of research. Post-war experimental aircraft occasionally incorporate differential thrust as a control mechanism, though the concept never becomes mainstream in fighter design. The real lesson is subtler, that unconventional solutions to aerodynamic problems might be found through operational experimentation rather than purely through engineering analysis. Perhaps the most significant legacy is cultural rather than technical. The single-engine dive technique demonstrates that combat pilots, operating under life-or-death pressure, can discover solutions that escape engineers and designers. This validates the importance of rapid feedback loops between operational units and development teams, a concept that becomes foundational to post-war military aviation development. The days when aircraft designers delivered a finished product and expected pilots to simply adapt are ending. The P-38 experience shows that the best aircraft systems emerge from genuine collaboration between those who design aircraft and those who fly them in combat. For the pilots who flew P-38's in Europe during 1943 and 1944, the technique represents something more personal. It's proof that they can adapt, improvise, and overcome limitations in their equipment through skill and innovation. The P-38 never becomes the dominant fighter in Europe that pre-war expectations had predicted, but it serves effectively once its crews learn to work within and around its limitations. Hundreds of pilots bring their Lightnings home safely using a technique that doesn't exist in any technical manual, discovered not in an engineering lab, but in the desperate improvisation of combat at 22,000 feet. That's the kind of innovation that doesn't appear in official histories, but changes the outcome of air battles and saves lives. One shutdown engine and one controlled dive at a time.